Welcome to another edition of More Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. Tonight we have a special person with us today, Bob Wolfson, who's a former ADL Director in Omaha, Nebraska. He's also an attorney and was outspoken on Jewish issues with ADL in this community for many years. I've known Bob for, I would say, at least 10, 20 years because he's actually been much more involved in advocacy on race issues, you name it. He moved to New York for a while. I heard that he took the role with the head position, someone working at ADL. So again, they grabbed him from Nebraska, brought him to New York because they wanted some heavy light. Subsequently, I know that he's also been in Florida. He's back in Omaha living. I invited him because he was part of that old advocacy, the advocacy where you speak truth to power and so on. And many are not always aware of our collective struggles and so on. And one incident that really resonated with me was years ago, Bob was in the room at the TAC building, and we had some skinhead types, racist kind of neo-Nazi personalities putting out propaganda flyers on people's cars. And we had kind of a community meeting at the TAC building. And there was some African-American woman who stood up and says, what can we do to get along with them? And how do we approach them? And And Bob, being the person, he stood up and says, I'm not going to reach out to those skinheads or those white supremacists who put racist flyers out there, particularly those who want my demise, who want to hurt me or kill me. And for me, it was a profound statement the way he said it. We didn't talk much about it afterwards, but it resonated with me because it goes back to something that Malcolm said, is there's some people you can't reason with when they're at that point. And also, I would say, Bob, he was been very much involved in tracking some of these Black, white, Jewish, African-American agendas over the years. And so he's the kind of guy who has a thick skin, but he also has the wherewithal to deal with many of these issues confronting us as a society and so on. And I invited him to talk about Whoopi Goldberg and give a little bit more insight on this Jewish-Black relationship and some things he's been working on. So I'm going to start off, Bob, and say, welcome to Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. I'm A'Jamal Byndon from another planet, but again, part of MORE, which is Movement in Omaha for Race Equity. So, Bob, welcome to our show.
Great to be here, A'Jamal. You are indeed an old colleague and friend, and I appreciate the invitation. I no longer work as a professional in the field, but after 30 years of, actually 40 years of doing this kind of work, it's part of your system, it's part of your blood. I love Omaha for all of its flaws, and God knows we have them. I really believe that Omaha is the kind of place that I hope in the next 50, 100 years, we can actually be a light unto the communities, that we can actually figure some of these issues out because we're small enough to know each other. So I look forward. I'm always trying to be optimistic. My boss used to say, when people ask, are you an optimist or a pessimist? He said, depending on the dam, a pessimistic optimist or an optimistic pessimist.
Good. Now, since you left, I don't know all the activities that you're involved in. Can you share a little bit more about your professional or what you did since you left Omaha? Because it's been a while since you and I talked about your career and your passion in the work or former work that you did.
Sure. When I was asked to go to New York, I became the head of all of the 28 offices of ADL in the country. So there were 28 offices. I had millions of dollars of budget and hundreds of people working for me. And I was advising and coaching and helping people resolve these kinds of issues in 28 different places in the country.
Okay.
So big cities, small cities, and all of the geography from Alaska to Florida, from Maine to San Diego.
Okay, good. Now, I had a response on Facebook about a Latino. We were talking about one of the things I wanted to touch base with you on was this Whoopi Goldberg incident. And I had this Latino who said that she was wrong, yet she was right. And I want to get your perspective of that incident or how that situation handled, because I think I have some other questions I want to ask you about related to the Jewish way you approach race and skin color and so on and religion. So tell me a little bit, just give a good backdrop of how you approach that controversy. And I'm sure you've been following it by virtue of who you are.
Yeah. Well, the first thing and most important thing is that most Americans don't really understand that race and racism are relatively new concepts. That they were, it's actually pseudoscience. It's a bunch of nonsense of trying to get people into different tribes of one kind or another based on their skin color or based on their identifiable characteristics. For sure, when race became a feature in the late 19th century,
Mhm.
Around the time sociology, philosophy, psychology became sciences, there was an effort to divide the human experience into these different groups and to explain what was different between our experiences based on race. Now, that doesn't mean that race has not played a feature in the history of our lives. It just means that I refuse in my adult life to accept the racism that is inherent in that conversation from the very get-go. I don't look at race the same way that many racists look at it. So for Jews, this is particularly complicated because while in America, most Jews are from the Eastern European area, from Poland, Germany, Russia, the majority of Jews in Israel are from Middle Eastern countries and are brown and came from Bulgaria and Morocco and Tiberias and even Ethiopia. So if you go to Israel today, they certainly don't look like the average synagogue in Omaha, Nebraska looks like today. So clearly, and even in our own community, we have an increasing number of Jews of color.
Mhm.
Some of them because they've been adopted as infants by Jewish families, some of them because their families have converted to Judaism, but you could be as easily Jewish as I am
Hmm.
and as authentically Jewish as I am. Judaism has nothing to do with the parents that you have and the racial categories that society places upon us based on skin tone and skin color.
Mhm.
That said, the Nazis, so now we're going to talk, before we can talk about Whoopi Goldberg, we've got to set the context a
Right.
little bit. So the Nazis adopted a racial philosophy based on the pseudoscience of eugenics, which eugenics was mostly founded and propagated in the United States.
Mhm.
And the idea of eugenics was if you were genetically or culturally underclassed, under the norm that whoever it was that was making up the rules wanted you to, you were less than human. Now, that is in the context of 350 years of slavery.
Right.
And I still think that if you talk to a lot of white people and you ask the question, when was the Black community freed? A lot of white people think the Emancipation Proclamation. And I would argue, at the very least, and I don't believe this is a sufficient explanation, but at the very least, the best you can say is with the Civil Rights Acts in the 60s.
Okay.
Because
Wow.
if you don't have a right to vote, you can't even begin to imagine what freedom looks like in the modern context of a republic.
Or even if we would say quality education. So when you have these, David Bachman wrote a book akin to slavery, where even after slavery was over, enslaved people is a term they use now, you had police officers, sheriffs arresting African Americans, putting them in a chain gang and getting away with it because the court system, the county system allowed that. Now I want to ask you a little bit something.
Wait.
Switch up. Go ahead.
We got one second more. So when the Nazis took the eugenics idea and applied it first to handicapped people,
Right.
then to political dissidents, then to homosexuals, and finally the Jews. The Jews were identified by the Nazis as a race. And they targeted Jews as a race, and they tried to eliminate Jews as a race. So when somebody says it was white people against white people, it's not entirely false because the Germans were Anglos, they were white Europeans.
Okay.
And the Jews who were primarily the victims of the Nazi aggression and genocide were themselves those Jews, were Polish, were Russian, were German.
Okay.
And they tried to exterminate us based on what they believed was our racial characteristics.
Okay.
That doesn't mean we ever believed of ourselves as a race. We still don't. We don't identify as a race.
So Bob, here's why I'm confused. So if you don't identify race, does that mean that the economy of your religion is what carries you? Because what Whoopi did, I think, is she made the assumption, a statement that if you're white, you belong to the same ethnic group or some sort, meaning skin color. So therefore, it's not the same as what African Americans or Hispanics or Native Americans or Asians experience in this country. Remember, she's seeing race from a purely contextual United States philosophy. And I know in Brazil, they look at race differently. You got people who are as white as you who will say they're black by virtue of their grandparents and so on. Whereas in this country, we look at your physical pigmentation or skin color, whatever, and we'll say, oh, you're white. And again, not that necessarily you're passing, but help me understand this European race thing contrasts to what we would say race in the United States.
Well, they're very similar because a lot of the laws in the early part of the 20th century, as it applies to marriage between whites and blacks, had to do with, 1/4, one drop of black blood in your genealogy, and you were impure. You couldn't marry. You couldn't be married to a person who had, great grandparents who were black.
Right.
And similarly, the Nazis said that if you had one grandparent who was Jewish, biologically Jewish, you were targeted for extermination.
Wow.
So it all plays into the same kind of idea that you can categorize people based on this notion. Now, for many people, the Jewish community is even more complicated because we're not just a religion. There are many Jews who are not religious at all.
I found that out later in life. Like I heard of the concept atheist is Jew. Is that a contradiction or what?
Absolutely. There is no requirement of a belief in God in our religion.
Wow.
And so it gets confusing to people that are outside of our culture because we want to either understand you as a religion, a nationality, a race, an ethnicity. And for Jews, we're all of those.
Right. Excellent.
We could be all of that. And I remember in 5th grade in the Omaha public schools, they sent out a census card. And I remember going home at lunch. It was a little yellow census card. And we had to fill out our name and our address. And then it said, what's your race? And do you know what the first category was?
No, I have no clue.
Caucasoid.
Oh, wow.
You know what the second category was?
I had to go black, right?
Negroid.
Oh yeah. Okay. That's how. Yeah.
The third category was Mongoloid, which they meant by that Southeast Asian.
Right.
And then there was an other category.
So they didn't have Native American or Indians.
Other.
Okay, they went in others. Okay, the original people of the land.
That we stole from them. They weren't even recognized on the census card.
That's pathetic.
And so we went home and I asked my mother, how am I supposed to answer this question? And my mother said, I don't know how you're supposed to answer that. So on the way to school from lunch, all of us Jewish kids got together and we put other and we wrote down human being.
Funny, man.
And we figured that caused probably $100,000 worth of headaches for somebody.
Bob, I didn't know it was such a challenge because I was somewhere and someone didn't know how to deal with people who were biracial. And again, biracial, they've also delineated or pulled that out. And so you don't necessarily have to pick either race when you have a parent of different racial groups. But one of the challenges is that we spend so much time in sometimes these agendas that we fail to get to the end of the conversation of what we need to be about as a community. I want to switch up and I want to go back directly into Whoopi's comments. She made a formal apology about that incident with the head of the ADL. Again, it's like she's going to the head honcho, and he accepted her apology. And my question is, was it correct for the overseer, that's a use of words here, of the network to put it on suspension after that as that form of repentance when there was that forgiveness? And I do know from some of my Jewish friends, sometimes that repentance between us as human beings is sometimes more important than the almighty above God or so. But help me understand, did he overstep it? Give me some of your feedback on how Whoopi was treated as contrast to maybe somebody else.
Well, unfortunately, this feeds into the sort of cancel culture philosophy of people on extreme political views. When somebody is doing it, I tell people, when you are born in a minority in the United States, whatever that minority status is, you have a very active radar.
That's
And
true.
that radar picks up the attitude by which you ask a question. Whoopi Goldberg apologized sincerely. She didn't mean to hurt anybody. And she's being educated about what this is all about. And for our community, for the majority of our community, that's enough. But in our cancel culture, where people call for boycotts of networks, or stop buying products, or advertisers stop spending their money on The View, Whoopi's got to take some hits from the bosses, because they want to make sure that they make an example when anybody does something that is really off bounds.
Mm-hmm.
I think Whoopi did the right thing. She found out what she did was a misstatement. She found out that the Nazis actually targeted Jews because they thought they were targeting a race. So she wasn't wrong in saying it wasn't racial in the American kind of racial sense. But she was wrong in saying that the Jews weren't targeted because of their race, because historically that's precisely what the Nazis were doing. So she's right and she's wrong. She's being educated. We believe in redemption. We believe in apologies. We believe, look, if you have a conversation that's real about race and ethnicity and religion in this country, and you don't screw up, you're not talking, you're not talking real stuff.
Right.
So
I agree.
If we can't forgive each other when we slip up and the consequences are real, I mean, really, somebody said on the news the other night, she's a commentator on a show called The View.
Right.
She was expressing her opinion. Her opinion was wrong. Okay. There are lots of people with wrong opinions. So I think the consequences outweighed the faux pas. And I think she's having to deal with that. And it's pretty nasty when, if I said something that offended you about a racial sensitivity, I hope, and I know, because I know you well enough, you would be kind enough to me and graceful enough to me to correct me.
Right. That's what we do.
Not because you wanted to make me an enemy. We used to say that's the way you create anti-Semites. That's the way you create racists. Somebody who says something that's racially insensitive and you hammer them, you almost guarantee that you're going to turn somebody more against a racial reconciliation and racial conversations.
Got you. Appreciate it. Yeah, Bob. And I think what I find unfortunate, at least locally, I haven't seen a lot of people talk about it in our community in a local way. And I know that back in the day, we used to do an awful lot of it in different community meetings and things. And obviously with COVID-19, people have to do the Zoom and the Facebook Live and stuff to do it. But it's very important to get to the essence of it. And I think in Omaha and in local communities, people want to have these conversations, but oftentimes our institutions don't facilitate that. I'm going to switch up and say, for those who've been hiding under a rock, or let's say hiding under sports, I use that as a metaphor, hard rock, pun intended. Whoopi made the mistake of looking at race as being white is different from Jewish and religion. Help us understand how somebody can be Jewish, white, and not religious in the Jewish faith. You just alluded to it, but you're saying I can be Jewish and not be white, or I can be Jewish and not be religious. That's what I'm trying to get a little bit more understanding.
Yeah, we're a very complicated community. We're not so easy. So if people want to get to know us, we have open doors. On the religious side, we are very non-evangelical. We don't try and convince anybody that ours is the right way or any of that kind of stuff. But, Christianity was born out of the bosom of Judaism.
Okay.
Jesus himself was Jewish his entire life. There wasn't a Christian religion when Jesus was walking the earth. He was a master teacher of a tradition that existed 1,000 years, 1,500 years before he came on the scene. We still believe that the Messiah will come the first time. Christians believe the Messiah is coming a second time. And while there are many, many different religious differences and similarities, we are definitely related to each other. So the religions, all the Abrahamic traditions, Muslims, the Islam, Christianity, and Judaism come from the same basic source material.
Wow.
And believe in many of the same ideas. In all three of those traditions, there are people who have perverted those religious ideas to make extremist kind of rhetoric out of this religion of love and the religion of community building and the religion of making the world a better place and the religion that has as an idea that we as human beings in partnership with the divine, or if you're not a believer, at least with human beings, can create a better world. It's not just about my personal gain, it's about the place I live and the country I live and the world that I occupy. And so religiously, that does not require you to go to prayer services. That doesn't require you to have dietary laws. It doesn't require you to wear your religion on your sleeves. And the same is true in Islam. You have all different varieties of people who celebrate Islam. And you have all kinds of varieties of people who celebrate Christianity. Even some Christians who believe they're Christians who other Christians don't think are Christians.
Why? Right.
And so religion is a very complicated subject, and you and I could talk about that for ages.
Right.
But for Jews, it's a little more confusing for some because we also have a notion of peoplehood.
Okay, got you.
So even without our religion, there are people who believe as a people, we have been subjugated to bad things in history, and we have a bond with our brothers and sisters, whether they are new to the religion, born to the religion, in the culture, not practicing the culture, just born Jewish. We have a sense of a bond like you might have with somebody that you meet that has similar cultural backgrounds or identities.
Diaspora. I got you. I'm with you.
Right. Now, that doesn't mean that they understand the diaspora the same way you do.
That's true.
It doesn't mean they understand history the same way you do, but there's something about that. Now, when you talk about why do Jews want to go to Florida or New York or Chicago, why do a lot of our kids end up in larger urban areas? It's because Jewish life in Omaha is small.
Okay.
And Jewish life in those big cities is large.
Okay.
We migrated away from the small communities to bigger towns because we had synagogues, we could get better food, we could have better communities. Do you know why most of the African-American executive level C-suite people in Omaha who have been recruited here don't stay? Do you know the reason?
They don't feel that community they may have felt when they've been elsewhere.
They don't have a place to go dance and drink on Friday nights. they don't have a cultural context that's the same as it would be in St. Louis or even Chicago or
Atlanta,
Denver,
Georgia, right? Big cities, right?
Or Georgia. Where so it isn't that it also matters what the companies do and what our community does. Right. There are other issues, but it's mostly about if you went to Morehouse and you lived in Atlanta and you come to Omaha, the state of the culture in the Black community and its relationship to the majority community is not the same.
You know what? I understand that clearly. The reason I haven't spent 2 years in Botswana in the Peace Corps, I tell people that when I was in the majority in Africa, I felt like I died and going to heaven. Again, me being an atheist, that's kind of a profound statement in the sense where you don't have to deal with racism. And I also say, reverse it where you're the only one, or you are white and you're in an area and everybody's of a different racial group. There's a certain kind of complexity you feel and so on. I want to switch up if I can. I want to ask you this concept, and I think, which is probably key to what we're talking about, is at one point, Jewish people, Irish people, different people were treated not as white. And there's a book out by How the Irish Became White by Noor Inge, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, and I saw a similar book about how Jewish became white. And so my question to you is, what is that distinction between being an oppressed minority, even in the United States, as being white, and then all of a sudden you became white of the dominant group? So my question is kind of asking you is, as a Jewish person, are you in a sense passing as white, are you seriously, as we would say, the way these folks wrote back in the day, that there was so distinction that they didn't treat you as part of the white race? And you alluded to a little bit with this Anglo-Saxon thing, but give me a little clarity on how Jews or Irish became white and how come they were not white from the beginning when they got off the boat.
Yeah. So the first thing that you need to know is that no one's ever accused me of passing for white. When you start a conversation with me and now, if I'm with people who are of different ethnic and racial categories, I admit that I have white privilege that comes from passing as a white person in the United States.
Okay.
But I also do not identify as a white person. If you ask me for my identity, you will never see Anglo-Saxon, Caucasian, white. That is not the way I identify myself. But the way that worked was when we stole the land from the original native indigenous peoples here. They wanted as many people to come to the United States to settle this stolen land as fast as they could. And the world had immigration problems anyway. The Irish famine, the Jewish anti-Semitism in Europe. There were all kinds of different reasons why people came. In some cases, they came just because they wanted better money. There were better economic opportunities. But we came basically penniless. The majority of the Jews, some Jews came from Germany between 1850 and 1900 that came with some money. Jews were among the first settlers. There are documented Jews that were on the boats of Columbus. So Jews have been in North America since the very beginning, some with pride, some with shame. But when the Jews began to settle, we settled like everybody did in the bad neighborhoods, in the poor neighborhoods. So in Omaha, there was a very large community in South Omaha near the packing houses, and in North Omaha, where Jews were able to establish stores along 24th. And as soon as people were able to move to better houses, people saved their money. They got people from their families over from Russia, and they came and they built up their grocery stores, their bakeries and all that. And as soon as they could move to a better house, they did. When Blacks came into Omaha from the South, they also moved into North Omaha and South Omaha. And by the way, in many cases, renting the homes that Jews had left to go to better houses. And when that happened, it created a really wonderful history for about 50 years in North and South Omaha of great mixtures of people and cultures, people who were neighbors and treated each other well, and really until the riots of the 60s, that continued. And another factor in that was that Jews, even as early as the early 1910s, were very active in civil rights. So they were active participants in the forming of the Urban League and the NAACP. And then when there was a shift in the 60s, sort of the Jewish men came back from the war. Many of them for the first time were permitted to go to law schools and medical schools on the GI Bill. Blacks were still not, that was not available to them, even those that served. They came back. The women had worked in good jobs. The men had came back to careers or businesses. And then in the 50s and in the early 60s, civil rights was the main theme. Then for a short period after that, the women's movement became the thing. But when the 60s, mid 60s, sort of Martin Luther King, what happened? No, over there.
Where?
And sort of Martin Luther King until he was assassinated, I would say. The Black community was becoming much more powerful in its advocacy for itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jews who had been engaged at the highest level, locally and civically and nationally in these organizations, were essentially nicely disinvited from leadership positions.
So in other words, there was this pushback that many of us may not have known about. Let me switch up because I know we only got so much time and I still want to get to a couple of questions with you.
Sure.
Over the past years, I've noticed that particularly after the George Floyd situation, that institutions, organizations are sometimes speaking out about racism. These so-called organizations have not ever issued statements about race. Now they're doing it out of, I suspect, guilt, or that was a tremendous impact on our society, also across the globe. And my question is, how are we dealing with race relations today from your perspective? And I alluded to when I introduced you is that you come from a bit of the old school. You and I are much past that age where we saw some of the things happen in the 60s and the 70s, particularly in Omaha. But how do you rate that? Because I get asked that question all the time. And as a Jewish person, where are you at on that conversation when people approach you?
Well, for me, my first answer is, where the hell have you been? You know, you got to be deaf, dumb, and blind for the last 50 years, since the mid 50s anyway, or certainly since the early 60s. You got to be deaf, dumb, and blind to not understand that race is the prime issue of divide in the United States on all sorts of different levels. Mm-hmm. And my problem is that when these things happen, and this is not the first time that we've been through one of these cycles, the question you should be asking is, where have you been? What have you been doing? If you think that now you're going to be able to say, well, I saw what happened with George Floyd, or I saw what happened when Bull Connor, put fire hoses on children and arrested people because they were peacefully protesting, and whites got to be guilty about that. And so they had studies and they did this and they had these meetings and all that. And my answer is what I think a lot of Black people say is, you got to be kidding me.
Where you been?
Well, what do you mean that you suddenly got changed by George Floyd and you woke up to discover that Blacks are being shot by cops? Right. Are you kidding me?
It's been happening for indefinite. And people, that's one reason I think our educational system does a disservice, not only at the university, but at the local level, by not focusing on some of those things that people experience that become traumatized.
Come on, man. Where have you been?
Right.
And
I agree. I'm with you.
And my sense is that, again, I'm thrilled that there are more white people today on the journey.
Good.
I'm thrilled that there are people who are coming to this conversation with open hearts and open minds. I'm thrilled at the number of books that are being written to help people understand white privilege and racism and institutional racism and inadvertent bias, right, and all of the things that can happen white people suddenly talking about the conversation.
Right, which is important. I'm going to switch up a bit. Bob, I know we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about issues related to Jewish, African American, so on. And back in the day, again, if you go, as you alluded to earlier, the civil rights, there were Blacks and Jewish people who were part of a coalition. And again, even in Omaha, I understand there was a number of groups who had some relationships and did things together. We did some stuff, obviously, a few years back when we did Table Talk. And my question is, I don't see a lot of coalitions of Jewish and African Americans as I did in the past. Explain a little bit what's going on and not happening in light of all the stuff that we're confronting, from the Charlottesville situation to the Black church, people being murdered, the Jewish synagogues people been killed in the place of worship. It's like, how dare you? And we as a society allow that to happen. And I remember when the guy who went to that African American church, the police officer took him to get a hamburger. I'm like, are you serious? So my point to you is, talk to me about this lack that I don't see as much, the Jewish and African American coalition that used to exist back in the civil rights, as you alluded to earlier in the show.
Well, I think it's an unfortunate reality that for a lot of people, coalition work is messy and difficult. And particularly in civil rights, I would say the two biggest issues over the last 30 years that have caused both the withdrawal of some of the civil rights work that was done, although national organizations and individuals are still in the trenches. I consider myself still in the trenches. The two big issues were Minister Farrakhan and LGBTQ issues. So many people don't understand that the Latinx community and the Black community are socially very conservative. And we had lots of civil rights meetings where the gay community would show up and ministers who were otherwise interested in civil rights work would stand up and walk out because they couldn't find themselves the way to deal with that. Well, that to me is an internal Black community issue that's not up for me as a Jewish guy who's a civil rights guy to solve. On the Farrakhan issue, look, we all have our issues. Farrakhan is, from my point of view, has been a rank anti-Semite for the last 30 years. He's not changed. He's not going to change. And in spite of that, like some of the early days of Malcolm X, I can disagree with him and still find things that I think are right. Right. So Malcolm X and Minister Farrakhan, in my view, are right about one thing. And that is that if the Black community can learn anything from the Jewish community, it would be to support your own community financially. Wow. So we learned a long time ago that if I have my dentist and my lawyer and my advisor and my banker, and I seek out those people who are in my community, I go to the First National Bank and say, if you have an officer who's Black, I would prefer dealing with that person. Right. Now, you have a danger in being a reverse racist, but the truth of the matter is, I don't think a Black person spending money in a Black business anywhere is racist. It's like Wall Street, as you all know, of the Wall Street phenomenon, what happened in Oklahoma back in 1991. Yeah. So Tulsa, it was a mind-boggling situation of economic success for African Americans who had to escape from being a slave a few generation or two, and all of a sudden they're successful, then people get jealous and do some stuff. They burn them down. Right, which is, and a lot of people don't know that. Even when I'm teaching Black studies, they were surprised when you go from our school system, a lot of people didn't know that. I would ask a different question. I'm gonna switch up on you a little bit is, I know that you do consultant work. What does that entail in terms of what you were doing? Because I didn't follow you after you left Omaha, but you said you worked for the ADL, but I know now you're doing consultant work. So what are you doing as a consultant dealing with some of the topics? What does that mean? Yeah, so in my work at ADL, I did a lot of work with boards and with executive development. So the area until COVID hit that I spent most of my time was coaching executives of social impact organizations, talking to people who are interested in social change, okay, in community organizing, in making change at scale. Trying to solve problems and do it in a way that is successful. Government, local government, funders, philanthropists, community leaders are often on very different pages. And I'm a pretty good guy at trying to find ways of bringing those forces together, because integrating those forces is the only way forward. Since the Great Society, we've understood that just handing people money is not going to fix it. It doesn't empower people. It doesn't elevate people's training. It doesn't help the community build its assets. So like I said, the work that I've been doing recently is, I believe, one of the great strengths besides the Black community's resilience is the Black community's faith communities. And I believe those are underutilized by everybody. Now, I don't mean like utilized, like taking advantage of. I mean having a voice and being part of crafting community-wide energies that can really change the system. Right. And the church and the leadership of the church, not just the minister, but the community of the churched world, if it was focused in the right way, could change our community. And by the way, that's true in the general community as well. I mean,
Right.
it's not just the Black community, but in the
Right.
Black and brown community, if you want to talk about schools and government, they are among the least trusted institutions
That's
in
true.
society.
That's true.
But the church, while there is a healthy skepticism in some, the church is a very trusted institution for the most part.
Brother, I want to switch up because you said something that piqued my interest, and I found it interesting how you said it. Is the LGBTQ plus agenda kind of threw things out of kilter or out of whack? And the reason I say that is we're going to do some event in one of our more things that deal with race and so on, and we approached the church in a particular community. I got to mention Lincoln, Nebraska. And the people came back and says, we don't want to deal with LGBTQ, even though initially they wanted to bring it together. And one of the advisors, who's a white woman who's been involved in anti-racism work and implicit bias, says, no, you don't combine them because they're two different populations. So my point is, when you alluded to that, would that get you in hot water with that particular group by saying what you just said, that sexual orientation and proclivity, and as Dave Chappelle got in a little hot water when he called them the alphabet people, is that something that takes away, or does it add, going back to what you said about coalition building with other people who've experienced oppression? Explain that a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that we have to decide. I look at that problem for especially conservatives in minority communities a little like, I encourage people to think of it like the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church likes to say, we love the sinner, but we hate the sin. I'm not asking you to sit down at a meeting on civil rights issues where there's a gay person to accept their lifestyle is compatible with your own religious beliefs. I'm asking you to understand that those people are treated as the other, like other people are treated as the other. Okay. And the dynamic of that is similar. It's not the same, it's similar. And whether you love them or not, whether you accept them or not, personally or religiously, is irrelevant to the civil rights struggle.
Gotcha. I understand.
And we might differ on whether we should pass local laws on that issue or not. And that's okay. You can differ on policy questions, but if you don't wake up to the fact that people with AIDS were treated like they were not even human.
Right. I understand.
That's just, you got to roll a little bit with this. The struggle of the otherness is a struggle that crosses lots of different lines. It's not the same in the gay community as it is in the Black community, as it is in the Hispanic community, as it is in the indigenous peoples community, as it is in the mixed race community, as it is in multi-ethnicity community. But you gotta be able to hang with that.
Right. No, and I think that's why the conversation is so important, Bob, because some people shy away because they don't know how to frame it or ask it because they don't want to offend someone, or they're afraid that they'll get labeled homophobic. And I always tell people I'm a recovering homophobe or recovering sexist, and so work with me. But at the end of the day, don't demonize me or cancel me because I asked a question when I'm trying to get greater knowledge. One point I want to come back to is some years ago, a Catholic colleague shared with me in Omaha that the public school teachers in Omaha had to go additional training to teach about the Holocaust. And particularly this training was coordinated by the ADL. I didn't know anything about it till she came to me. She actually worked at a Catholic school, this particular student, and I knew her mother through the work. And she indicated the information was good. I mean, she said there was not a challenge on the content of the academic quality of the material. But my question to her is, why are not African-American teachers of Black Studies Department doing something similar? Because again, I see a lot of these imposters and half-baked personalities trying to teach culture and issues from a new age level where they don't understand the movement. Again, our history is just built upon our ancestors and those who've come before us, and they sometimes will start the chapter on Black Lives Matter versus that. So my question is there anything like that you know of nationally where people get to be brought outside the traditional educational structure to learn about culture? And I know Jewish people do it with this ADL thing that you talked about, but I'm not familiar of high schools, teachers being educated about Afrocentric stuff, African, so on, as to create that impetus for scholars when they get to the university. Last point. I tried to teach a course in Omaha, Nebraska in Black Studies on Malcolm X, and it could not get 9 students. And one of my criticisms of the Black Studies Department is that we need to go upstream, because if Malcolm was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and we can't have a course on the books with 9 students, what are we doing in our community? Go back to the Jewish community here, the same situation. If you got Jewish students coming out of high school, or you got teachers teaching the Holocaust, how do I teach it if I don't talk to the very subject of the people who are in charge of that content? So help me a little bit understand, is some of that occurring in other places where we do a better job of teaching ethnicity, race, Jewish religion, culture, things like that in our secular institution?
No question that there's 2 different issues. One is the actual teaching of the Holocaust. And I would urge you as a community leader, Malcolm X Foundation, who has a new leader, anybody that can, to bring academically solid curricular materials to the schools and say, look, you can come watch a seminar that we're leading on this, and let our kids be exposed to it. And if it can't be exposed there, then invite kids to institutions on their own on a Saturday or a Sunday or an evening to experience some of the history of Omaha, some of the history of the Black culture in Omaha, of the Black experience, about the riots and all of the things that may not be being taught in the school. We do that through the Holocaust, and it goes back to our earlier conversation, which has to do with resilience. I think without knowing your history, you don't appreciate the resilience of your people.
Right.
And I think it's a really important subject and needs much more exploration. And I think if done right, there could be lots of opportunities to provide that kind of education. I don't think we do a good enough job in Omaha on that.
Right. The other thing is, we're getting close to the end, but something I want to just kind of chat with you a little bit on. In the work that you've done and the work that I've done, we oftentimes put ourselves in situations, I might call it harm's way, but challenge ways where we get pushed. And you use the term more than once, cancel culture. What does that mean when you use the word cancel culture? Because some people don't quite understand that word in the context that you used it.
I think there's a certain, not to use religious words, but there's a certain grace that one should have when you're engaging with somebody with whom you may not agree,
Okay.
or who comes from a different point of view as you. And unfortunately, I think we've lost those skills, or they're certainly more challenged than they used to be. And cancel culture is the idea that if I say something that offends you, or you say something that offends me, the answer to that is we hang up the phone. Mm-hmm. Or I sent out a message that A'Jamal is a bigot. Mm-hmm. And the answer is to educate and to use opportunities to use our rational selves to try and find common ground. At the end of the day, we breathe the same air, we eat the same foods, we live in the same communities. And we share this little globe that is getting smaller and smaller every day. And we have to work hard to find better ways of dealing with those kinds of things. And now it's happening on college campuses, it's happening in classes, it's happening on school grounds. There are schools that are being asked to not use certain books in the library. There are churches that are burning books for which they have things in it that they think their children shouldn't learn. And we've got to find a way to honor those people's desire to keep their children away from certain learnings, but at the same time share a common space together where we don't cancel everybody's intellectual curiosity and a desire to learn about the world. Cancel culture is the idea that critical race theory actually applies to anything beyond legal doctrines. Cancel culture is the idea that if you say something in the World Herald that I disagree with, I should call the World Herald and say you should stop carrying A'Jamal's editorials. That's the idea of canceling discourse. I think we need more of it, not less of it. Gotcha. So the faster you find that kind of cancel culture, the more red flags should go up in your mind that's an environment that you might be wasting your time trying to help.
Bob, we're down to I'd say maybe 5 or so minutes or one. And as you alluded to, the question I did not ask you, but it's on the table, this whole disinvestment of Israel. And basically, one of the things that I raised in a point is back in the day in the civil rights movement groups had to boycott the buses to get their rights. And so that financial leverage was pushed against them. Excuse me. In the case of Israel, people are doing the same thing with don't buy or trade with Israel because of how they treat the Palestinians. How do you juxtapose that conversation in light of it was a very effective to get them to back off and help with Rosa Parks? In the case of Israel, people are making laws that you can't even talk about not investing in the country. Help me understand a little bit more about the economy, or are they similar or not from your vantage point?
They're very different. First of all, for the Jewish people, we never left Israel unless a foreign power forced us to leave. So we're returning home. Israel is our homeland. And it's been culturally and religiously our homeland for over 3,000 years. So, and the history of that area of the world is the most complex history on the face of the earth. So if what you're saying is that you want to draw attention to the flaws of the Israelis, and you do not look at the flaws of the Palestinian community and the efforts that have been made to reach peace agreements, then it is easy for Jewish people to come to the conclusion that you're not against Israel, you're against Jews, because Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people. So I would recommend that some of the people that want to boycott Israel do not say anything about Tibet, Taiwan, East Timor, the Houthis and the Tutus. I could go on and on and on. So when you are a progressive, and when the only thing you want to talk about is how badly the Palestinians are treated, then go to Israel and talk to the Palestinians who, if they live in Israel and you offer them the chance to either live under the control of the Palestinian Authority or the Israelis, even though they may have deep criticism of the Israeli government, will say they would rather live under Israel's government because the Palestinian Authority and the people that are running it today are either Hamas, who are outright terrorists in Gaza, or corrupt people on the West Bank. Wow. So there have been billions of dollars invested by the world in trying to create a Palestinian state. And for the most part, there is a disincentive for the creation of that state. And just as an aside, 60% of Jordanian population are Palestinians. And there are people, I'm not among them, who argue that the Palestinian state already exists. And I believe there should be a second Palestinian state called the State of Palestine. But if the State of Palestine wants to kill the people that are living 30 meters from their houses, then I have to tell you, I'm not so in favor of that.
Good. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I know that one of the things we don't do a good job of is deconstructing the conversation with people who are local in our community, because again, sometimes we read stuff on the national, local level, it becomes somewhat jaded. And we saw that coming out of the White House in the previous administration,
Sure.
when you're saying things about people who are trying to get here for a better way of life. But more than anything, we can disagree. And one of the reasons I invited you on the show was to talk with us, because I know you've always come with integrity. We're down to our last minute. So one of the things I always wanted to do is give you an opportunity and a closing prompt. Do you have any closing comment for our listening audience? And also, if somebody want to catch up with you, you say you're in Omaha now? Are you doing anything?
I am.
Work in Omaha?
Yep.
Okay. Talk a little bit more about closing comment, and then how can somebody catch up with you if they want to catch up?
Anybody can get a hold of me at bobwolfsonconsulting.com. That's my email address, and I respond. And some of my greatest memories are memories of leaders in the Black community like you. And I so appreciate your willingness to speak up, and you're still being in the fight. I know there's a lot of things that we still need to do and accomplish in Omaha. There's still a lot of work that we in the Jewish community and the Black community together can do. And I hope that there are brighter days for all of us. Omaha has a chance to be better. And I hope that we can be leaders in making that happen.
Well, I'll tell you, Bob, I appreciate you being able to come on Moore's show, Speaking Truth to Power, because obviously we throw down some heavy light. And again, part of the thing is bringing in those voices that are always paraded in the national media, but we need to parade them more in our local media, and then hopefully it bubbles up. But I really appreciate you spending the time with us. And again, this is an educational thing. I hope you don't charge us tuition for this information, but really appreciate you being in the circle for that long, because I see too many people who drop out. And again, when it becomes a way of your life, about your culture, it's a passion. As Ernie said years ago, when Father Time catches me, I hope I'm in motion. So that's kind of like what we're about, is when Father Time catches us, we're doing the right stuff to help our respective communities. And again, the humility, showing a sense of humility and helping all cultures who experience some of this level of pressure in our site. So appreciate you, Bob Wolfson, for being here, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do this again.
Thanks a lot.
We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light with More, and join us again next time. As we always say, may the force be with you, and Barocco.